Welcome everyone. Today I have another new episode, and this is all about the macroeconomic concept. And most important thing is that supply. What is model? Aggregate demand or aggregate supply model? A model that shows what determine real GDP and the aggregate price level through the interactive between total spending on domestic goods and services and total production by business. Aggregate demand, the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services in an economy. Aggregate supply, the total quantity of output farms will produce and sell. Aggregate demand curve, the total spending on domestic goods and services at each aggregate price level. Aggregate supply curve, the total quantity of the of output that farm will produce and sell at each aggregate price level. Foreign price effective, if the price rise in the United States while remaining fixed in other countries, then goods in the United States will be relatively more expensive compared to goods in the rest of the world. Interest rate effect, as the aggregate price level rise, the same purchase will take more money or credit to accomplish driving up interest rate. Long run, period of time during which all wages and prices are fully flexible. Long run aggregate supply curve, vertical line at potential GDP showing on relationship between the aggregate price level and the real GDP in the long run. Potential GDP, the maximum quantity that an economy can produce given full employment of its existing level of labor, physical capital, technology and institution, also known as full employment GDP. Short run, period of time during which wages are strictly in the response to a change in demand. Short run aggregate supply curve, positive short run relationship between the aggregate price level and real GDP, holding the price of input fixed. Wealth effect, as price level increase, the buyer's powers of saving that people have stored up in bank account and other asset will diminish. Aggregate supply, the horizontal axis of the diagram shows real GDP, that is the level of GDP adjusted for inflation. The vertical axis shows the aggregate price level. The slope of as curve changes from nearly flat at its far left to nearly vertical at its far right. As the quantity produced increase, however, certain farms and industries will start running into limit. In the long run, all wages and the price are fully flexible. As a consequence, all resources will be fully employed and real GDP will equal potential regardless of the price level. In the long run, real GDP will be independent of the price level and the long run aggregate supply curve will be a vertical line at potentials GDP. This can be seen on a graph as potential GDP or a LRAS. Just like aggregate supply curve, the horizontal axis shows real GDP and the vertical axis show the price level. The AD curve is downward sloping from left to right, which means that a decrease in the aggregate price level lead to an increase in the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services. Even though the AD curve look like a macroeconomics demand curve, it does not operate the same way. Wealth effective. As the price level increase, the buying power of savings that people say have saved up will diminish, eaten away to more or some extent by inflation. Because a rise in the price level reduce people wealth, consumption spending will fall as the price level rise. Interest rate effect. As price for output rise, the same purchase will take more money or credit to accomplish. This additional demand for money and credit will push interest rate higher, which will reduce borrowing by business for investment purpose and reduce borrowing by households for some homes and cars, thus reducing consumption and investment in spending. Foreign price effect. If price rise in the United States while remaining fixed in other countries, then goods in United States will be relatively more expensive compared to goods in the rest of the world. A higher domestic price level relative to the price level in other countries will reduce next export expenditure. Step 1. Draw up X and Y axis level, the X axis real GDP and the Y axis price level. Plot AD on your graph. Plot AS on your graph. Determine whether AD and AS intersect. Step 5. Look at the graph to determine where equilibrium is located. Step 6. Determine what the step portions of the AS curve indicates. And step 8. Draw a conclusion from the given information. If equilibrium occurs in the flat range of AS, then economy is not close to potential GDP and will experience unemployment but stable price level. If equilibrium occurs in the step range of AS, then the economy is close or at potential GDP and will be experiencing rising price level or inflationary pressure but will have a low unemployment rate. Considering the schedule below, what is the equilibrium price level and the real GDP? Demand shocks, even that shift the aggregate demand curve. Positive demand shocks, a rightward shift in AD. Negative demand curve, a leftward shift in AD. Business confidence, if business felt more confident, certain paribus, then firm tend to spend more on investment, believe that the future payoff from that investment will be suitable. If business confidence drop, then the investment spending decline. Consumer confidence, when consumers feel more confident about the future of the economy, certain paribas, they tend to increase spending. When they feel less confidence, they tend to decrease spending. Negative supply shock, a leftward shift in the SRAS and LRAS curves. Positive supply shocks, a rightward shift in the SRAS and LRAS curves. Stagflations, an economy experience stagnant growth and high inflations at the same time. Supply shocks, an event that shift both short run and long run aggregate supply curve. The most important factor shifting that AS curve is productivity growth. Productivity means how much output can be produced with a given quantity of input. Productivity growth so that same quantity of labor can produce more output. The real growth in GDP per capita in an advanced economy like the United States has averaged about 2% to 3% per year. Productivity growth has been faster during certain extended period like the 1960s and the late 1990s to the early 2000s, or slower during period like 1970. Business cycle represent the slowing down, decline and speeding up to the economy, or more formally recession and expansion. The AD and AS model give us one way to understand business cycle. Recessions occur as a result of negative demand or a supply shocks which cause the equilibrium level of real GDP to fall substantially below potential GDP. In the AD to AS diagram, cycle unemployment is the shown by how close the economy is to the potential or the full employment level of GDP. Cycle unemployment increase when the output fall subsidiarily below potential GDP on the AD. AS diagram as the equilibrium point E2. The ADAS framework implement the two ways that inflation pressure may rise. If aggregate demand continues to shift to the right when the economy is already at or near potential GDP and full employment, thus pushing the macroeconomics equilibrium into the step portions of the AS curve. So there is some quick review. What we learned from this: describe the aggregate supply demand model, define and explain the aggregate supply curve and economic behavior behind it, compare and contrast the short run and long run aggregate supply curve, define and explain the aggregate demand curve and the economic behavior behind it. What is the difference between the two concepts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Identify the equilibrium level of real GDP and equilibrium price level using the ADAS model. What conclusions can be made about the macroeconomy using ADAS supply model? More quick review. What are the cause and implications of the shift in aggregate demand? How does productivity growth and change in the input price change in the aggregate supply curve? Use the aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply model to explain recessions, expansion, and the economic growth. Explain how unemployment and the inflation can be explained using the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. What is the importance of ASDS model? These are the way we can understand the economic supply curve, and these are the way how we can start our economic model in an effective way. If we can go these things in an effective way, that time we can take the necessary initiatives. So I request all of the people, when you move with your economical aspect and economical strategy, you have to be understand the supply demand, aggregate demands and aggregate supply. And if you can determine this aggregate demand and aggregate supply, that times you can take necessary initiatives. So I request everyone, please be more analytics on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So thank you, Shahrukh. If you have any questions or anything that you want to share with us, you can share, and I will try to give you the question answer. Thank you, everyone.